Hello everyone, and welcome to the August edition of the Farmer Supply Association Agriculture Report. I'm Randy Klepechka, agronomist with Farmer Supply Association. Last month I used the horse racing analogy that we were kind of going around that final turn and heading for that home stretch, and August is here and we're in that home stretch right now. We're going quickly towards the end of this crop season, and just want to update everyone about where we're at with all our different crops. We're at a great location out east of Tuckerman, and we're going to talk about corn, soybeans, and rice, and we're going to do that all from one location. So just want to update you on where we're at with all of those crops. Of course, right behind me you see the corn. It's looking very good, and again it's on that home stretch, very near finishing this crop up. Couple of things I want to touch on as we finish this corn season. Number one is irrigation termination, and that's about where we're at with most of our corn crop right now. Of course, with corn, for those of you that have grown it know that we look at that starch layer within that kernel, and we watch it, and we kind of watch it advance down that kernel, and once it gets to the bottom of the kernel and we see that black layer at the bottom of the kernel, we know that we're mature and everything's made at that point. At that point, we just need to dry down and harvest the crop. So what we want to see as far as irrigation termination is good moisture in that field until that starch layer gets to the bottom and we see that black layer. So we're getting close. A lot of the corn I've looked at over the last several days is roughly 60%, 2/3 of the way starch layer down that kernel. So we're getting close. But we're still probably going to need another irrigation if it doesn't rain again. We're taping on the 7th of August. I got good rain forecast for next week, but we also had good rain forecast for last week and it didn't happen. So if we can get a good rain, next week with that forecast, we're probably going to be done with our corn. But for a lot of it, if we don't get that rain, we probably need one more to finish it up. So that's kind of where we're at with corn irrigation. I want to briefly touch on one of our worst diseases that we see in corn, and that's southern rust. Southern rust has made it up to northern Arkansas here recently over the last 2 to 3 weeks, I think. But most of our growers have fungicides out there preventatively, and most of those have held long enough. They're breaking loose now, and we're starting to see some southern rust. But for the most part, we're past the point we worry about that. When southern rust gets here and it's already in the dent stage, that corn is starting to dent at the end, then it's unlikely that we would get a return from a fungicide. So I think we beat southern rust if you did have a fungicide out there preventatively, and we're going to beat that. And then we're set up for a good crop with all those things happening. So again, we'll be starting to harvest the corn crop pretty soon. Our rice crop is advancing along really quickly. As you can see in the field behind me, this field is headed out. The heads are what we refer to as turned over. It means they're getting milk in those grains, and the weight is causing that head to turn down. So we're maturing pretty quickly depending on what the weather does. We'll be harvesting rice before too terribly long around here. 2 or 3 things to talk about as we finish up the season. Number one is stink bugs, and that's an issue that we deal with every year usually in rice, but this year has just been unbelievable as far as low numbers of stink bugs. When our rice first started heading out and I was looking at stink bugs, I would find maybe 2 or 3 per 10 sweeps, which is about half a treatment threshold. As we've advanced, I don't even find that now. We're just, a lot of fields I go in, we find 0 stink bugs, maybe 1 or something like that. So looks like we're going to get by without having to spray any stink bugs, which will be great, saving our farmers money, saving potential quality issues as well. So, but we can't let down our guard, because sometimes what we've seen in the past is the very latest rice, the stink bugs will build up, and sometimes those late maturing fields will need to be sprayed. So very lucky on stink bugs so far, but don't let your guard down until the time is finished for that. Next thing I want to talk about is diseases and fungicide applications. And we're pretty much past the point right now where we worry about diseases and fungicide applications. But I did have a couple of calls this week about fungicide applications in rice. Again, for the most part, we're too late. For the smut diseases, kernel smut and fall smut, once that head starts coming out of that boot and that boot splits, you're too late to get any effect from the tilt or propiconazole for the smuts. So at that point, no need in applying a smut fungicide. Looking at blast, which I don't think we'll have to deal much with blast this year, with the varieties we're having, the weather we're having, and an early rice crop and everything like that. Probably not going to have to worry about blast too much, but with blast, once the base of that panicle is out of that boot and you can see the base of that panicle, you're not going to get blast protection anymore even if you spray it. So with blast again, once that base of that panicle's out, if you spray after that, you're not going to do any good for blast. So again, a stopping point right there where we would not apply fungicides anymore. The exception to an extent would be sheath blight. You know, sheath blight, usually once you're heading, we don't worry about sheath blight too much if you haven't got to a threshold by then. But we can still possibly worry about sheath blight if we get to heading and the disease is approaching those top 2 leaves on the plant, then we might need to consider a fungicide application even at that late point. You could probably get by with a light rate because we're only going to need a couple of weeks of benefit from that fungicide. The last week of July, I did recommend a fungicide application on some Clearfield 151 where that was the case. They hadn't applied a fungicide for anything else, but when I was scouting the field, found large amounts of sheath blight out there, and it was approaching those top 2 leaves, and some of it was up in those top 2 leaves. So I made a recommendation to go ahead and spray that, but usually, again, at that point, you're not going to spray for sheath blight, and once those heads are fully out, there is a 35-day PHI with like a Quilt XL, the fungicide for sheath blight control. So once we get to that point, we're not going to worry about sheath blight anymore. So bottom line, we're pretty much out of the fungicide window, but still, you know, a few exceptions here or there on the later rice. Irrigation termination with rice. The goal of irrigation termination and draining in rice, in my opinion, is for that field to dry up just enough to support harvest equipment when that field is ready to harvest. You know, we don't want to dry up too early. I've seen us dry up too early and those stalks will deteriorate, the rice plants will lodge, and it's not a pretty sight. So we don't want to, you know, terminate or drain too early. On the other side, we all know what happens if we drain too late. You're going to cut through mud and rut the fields up, and that's very costly as far as repairing those ruts before the next crop. So what we've got to do is just pretty much a balancing act, and you know, try to get that field to dry just right there around harvest time. So, you know, there are some guidelines from the University of Arkansas. If you look at the DD50 printout, it calls for draining at 25 days after 50% heading on the long grain varieties, 30 to 35 on the medium grain varieties because they dry down a little bit slower with that fat kernel. You also can visually look at the head, and the U of A recommendation on that for our silt loam soils, we want about 2/3 of that head or panicle to be straw colored and the rest of it green, so that's the point where we would recommend draining. On clay soils, about half that field, you know, green, and half the panicle green and half the panicle straw colored. At that point, we would recommend draining. So those are some recommendations from the university. A rule of thumb I first learned when I started with extension that I still look at quite a bit. If you go out in the field and look at those panicles and the end grains are brown and the base grains are milky, then you're in pretty good shape at that point to go ahead and drain the field. We got to take into consideration what kind of soil it is, how fast the field dries, what the weather forecast is for the upcoming several days, and take all those things into consideration and use your knowledge of your field to try to make that draining recommendation. So that's where we're at with rice. I'm going to finish up talking about soybeans, and as always, soybeans are a lot more varied in their growth stages. You know, we've got soybeans that are still in the vegetative stage. In other words, they're not blooming yet. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we've got soybeans where the pods are pretty much almost completely filled out. So we've got a wide range of maturities there. So still several things to consider as far as management of soybeans. Probably the number one thing we're dealing with right now, besides irrigation, is corn earworm. Starting to see some corn earworm infestations in parts of our area. I've recommended some spraying on some fields and had some calls about what to spray, when to spray, and things like that. So we need to be scouting our fields for corn earworm, especially those later fields where maybe the beans aren't as large, they haven't lapped the middles, the moths can see the ground when they fly in, and that's where they like to lay those eggs. So need to be watching those fields for corn earworm after blooming. As far as treatment thresholds, there is a sliding scale, an economic threshold the University of Arkansas has. And depending on what the price of beans is and how much you're going to spend for control, that's what we base the treatment threshold on with this scale. So there's a pretty wide range. If you're using the cheap cheap insecticides for corn earworm control, then the threshold is quite a bit lower because you're not spending very much money to control them. So you know, you would recommend spraying at a much earlier point because you're not spending much money to do that. You don't have to get so much return to pay for that application. So with the cheaper materials like your pyrethroids, usually it's going to be 5 to 6 corn earworms per 25 sweeps. At that point, we would recommend treatment, or they would recommend treatment with that threshold. On the other end of the spectrum, if you're using the more expensive materials, the Previthons, the Besiges, those type of materials that are more expensive, but they provide much better residual and much longer residual than the pyrethroids do. So, in that case, the treatment threshold is going to be more because we're spending more money, but we're also getting a longer residual, which means if we had another reinfestation, in 2 or 3 weeks, we would get control from that material. So again, with those materials, that treatment threshold is going to be roughly in that 10 to 11 to 12 range. So you can see it's pretty much double the treatment threshold depending on whether you're using the cheaper materials or the more expensive materials. We also have mentioned halogen in the past, that biological virus type of control. It's kind of on the lower end of that cost range as well. But most of the fields I've looked at recently or last couple of days, there's getting to be too many worms in certain fields, and also we're getting a mix of larger worms and smaller worms. And remember, the halogen is only for smaller numbers of worms, less than 5 per 25 sweeps. So we need to consider that when making this. And also we need to, look at, again, 5 worms or less and less than a ½ inch long if we're going to use the halogen. We did have some halogen go out earlier this week in the last week of July, so hopefully that will be effective. But again, you got to have small worms and a small number of them with that. Looking at fungicides, not a lot of diseases out there with this weather we've got, but a lot of people, especially those high input people that are really putting money into their crop, are really trying to achieve those higher yields. I think a fungicide is a good preventative measure for those guys, and they need to be using those. So, again, if you got diseases or you're doing some of that higher input, really trying to make good, higher yields of beans, then you need to look at a fungicide application. In the past, we've kind of heard about R3, beginning pod set as being maybe the magic time to do that. I don't think there's anything magical about that time frame. I think you can go into R4 or even into R5 at times and get good effectiveness out of these fungicides. So let's keep that in mind. There's nothing magical about R3. You can wait till R4, those 3/4 inch pods, or those R5 when the seed starts filling out within the pod to make those fungicide applications. So again, just don't push that too early if you don't have to. I really like the later application if I don't have disease, because that'll extend that effectiveness of that fungicide a little bit later on. Maybe keep those beans greener a little bit longer. And while, I know we all want to harvest our beans as quickly as we can, there's something about keeping that plant greener a little bit longer that, promotes seed fill for a longer period of time and can really help our yields, because the longer that seed fill period is, the more time you have for that seed to get larger in that pod and fill out and make some better yields, I think. So again, don't worry about necessarily R3, and you can look at more to those R4 and R5 timings and get some good effects out of the fungicides. Irrigation termination, we've talked about that with corn and rice. With soybeans, our main thing with irrigation termination, we want those soybeans within that pod to be separated from that pod wall. Our soybeans, those seeds within that pod can gain weight as long as they're attached to that pod wall. So, we need to keep things going with irrigation as long as we can, to make sure we've got good moisture throughout the time that those beans start separating from that pod wall. So again, on the irrigation, wait till that soybean starts separating from that pod wall. A lot of times you'll start to see just a little bit of color change at that point, and that kind of alerts you to the point that we're pretty much there. So that's when we would want good moisture until that point. Also, if you're wanting to use a desiccant or harvest aid such as paraquat for helping with harvest, that would be the point. You wouldn't want to do anything before that as far as your harvest aid. You want those soybeans to gain all the weight they can and be separated from that pod wall before you start thinking about a harvest aid like paraquat. So that's kind of where we're at with our major crop. Wanted to mention grain sorghum. We don't have very many grain sorghum farmers out there, but for the ones that do, you need to be looking for the sugarcane aphid. It can be a very harmful insect in our grain sorghum. When you scout for sugarcane aphid, go out in the field, look for shiny leaves. That shininess is caused by honeydew, which is a substance secreted by the aphid. you will see that shiny substance on the leaf, and then if you look on the leaf above that, on the underside of the leaf above that, you will see those aphids. So when we see 25% of the plants have infestations of sugarcane aphid, we need to make a control application of Savanto. So again, keep your eyes open for these. If you have grain sorghum, it can be very detrimental to harvest. It can be detrimental to yield if you don't control these, so keep your eyes open for that. That pretty much finishes up for August, and I can't wait till September because that means we'll be talking about harvest. So until then, this has been Randy Klepechka with your Farmer Supply Association Agri Report for August.